All of the Hall of Records staff put an awful lot of time into putting this together today, and our theme is the struggle for education of black children in the 19th century Albany. And the display that you see in the back there has a lot of information of what happened in the 19th century when it came to black children in the city of Albany and their struggle for schooling. Education generally throughout the early to mid-19th century was private. There were no public schools back then, and you had to proceed and receive an education. Members of the community had to actually organize that to get it done. This was true of Albany's black community as well, and the struggle of Albany's black community to establish schools for its children. And we could document this information back to the early 1800s here at the Albany County Hall of Records. Benjamin Lattimore purchased a parcel of land from Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton, and I'm sure all of you recognize that name, the Schuyler family, from Alexander Hamilton's wife in 1811. In 1816, he and others successfully petitioned the New York State Legislature for permission to open a black school for children in Albany. Throughout the early to mid-19th century, education was provided by members of the community to other members of the community, and the churches were central to the project of establishing and maintaining schools, hosting them throughout the early to mid-1800s. And in the back there, you'll see a map with some green and red markers on it. Those are actually the areas where churches and schools were located in the 1800s for the black community to go to school. And it's quite interesting when you get into the Common Council minutes back there to tell you exactly the history of what happened with the black community in the 1800s when it came to school. It wasn't actually until 1841 that publicly funded education for children begins. There was a lot of policy of school segregation at that time in Albany, and black children back then were funneled into newly created, and a well-known source, Wilberforce School, from 1849 until the actual desegregation in 1873. Now this Wilberforce School wasn't exactly just in one location, so everybody knows. That Wilberforce School moved around the city of Albany from location to location, again using churches, using community halls, using whatever it took to get the black children in Albany educated at the time. It did finally relocate to the first African Baptist church, which is on Hamilton Street here in 1852. In 1850, segregation effectively became government policy. There were unsuccessful suits by Stephen Myers, and I'm sure we all remember who Stephen Myers is. We did a nice little presentation on Stephen Myers not too long ago, and others to have their children attend neighborhood schools. But that policy stood until 1873, when New York State ended the policy of school segregation. So essentially that's when all that ended, segregation. We're very thankful for that. So what you're going to see is a history of the struggle to establish schools for black children throughout the black community in the 1800s. Government's resistance to desegregation, and you'll see in the Common Council minutes back in the early to 1800s how difficult it was, that the Common Council back then was definitely not in favor of getting rid of segregation at that point. The prominent role played by black churches in the establishment and maintenance of the schools. Once again, the churches played a huge role in establishing areas to have schools for black children to go to and learn. And in the face of all these obstacles, self-reliance and self-organization amongst Albany's black community to provide an education to its children. To get to most for today's exhibit that we see here, please take a look at the documents. These documents include deeds, Albany Common Council minutes, a map of Albany that shows us where the schools and churches were in this struggle, which I pointed out in the back earlier. And I encourage you to discuss anything that you see in the back there with our staff from the Hall of Records, who are extremely knowledgeable on this subject and did a lot of research and a lot of time and a lot of effort. And as you can see by the display, it's well worth the time and effort. It's very interesting to see how this all took place in the 1800s. You know, the years that things were established, starting from 1811 with the purchase of that property, Going to 1816, where the legislature, where they went to the legislature to get permission to open schools, and into 1841, when they finally created the Wilberforce School, and finally in 1873 with desegregation.